Hi, I'm Carlin Borisenko. In early 2020, I was the knitting Democrat who accidentally went viral on the internet for going to a Trump rally and then left the party. I became the conservative darling, was on all the shows, traveled around the country, and then realized that conservatives were no better than Democrats. If there's one thing that I've learned, it's that both political tribes are two sides of the same coin. But it wasn't all bad. On my journey, I became obsessed with understanding the woke ideology and the culture war. I broke the story of the city of Seattle doing segregated training with its employees.
How bad has this stuff become? The city of Seattle has now put out, I'm not kidding you, this is according to Dr. Carolyn Borisenko, who's an organizational psychologist. The city of Seattle asked its white employees to voluntarily spend a day off in a training about their internalized racial superiority.
I broke the story that led to the first ever federal lawsuit against critical race theory in the schools. I broke the Coke Be Less White story, one of the biggest anti-woke stories of all time. It got over 30 million views. Coca-Cola's corporate headquarters even had to change their outgoing voicemail.
Throughout the past few days, you may have seen inaccurate reporting on the content of our recently launched diversity, equity, and inclusion training program.
I exposed the schools in Burlington, Vermont for grooming middle school children live on the internet. They called me an unwoke cult leader for that. And the Vermont Human Rights Commission slandered me publicly as being a hate channel. I even got called a hero in Breitbart for exposing that the Washington Post was writing a hit piece on Christopher Rufo. I have broken story after story after story about what's going on in the public schools, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, to autistic sex education, to the Department of Education in Michigan, literally training teachers all over the state how to groom children. I wrote a book called Actively Unwoke, the ultimate guide for fighting back against the woke insanity in your life. I host a podcast all about fighting back, and I'm downloading all of my knowledge to you on my Substack, carlin.substack.com. The world is a crazy place. We are literally surrounded by cults on all sides. On this show, we're going to do a deep dive into all aspects of the culture war, and I will show you the dark, dystopian underbellies on both sides. Here are the commitments I'll make to you. I will always tell you the truth. I will always bring you receipts. And if you stick with me, I promise you will see the world differently. Welcome to the cult. Please mount that like button for me and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Well, hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. And guess what? Today is a very, 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 very special day on the cult. Because today is not only the start of the Westnitz Mystery Knit-Along. Shout out to Judy. I got my yarn wound and everything. If you don't know what this is about, don't worry about it. It's a very special knitting project. It's a once-in-a-year knitting project where we knit a mystery shawl, okay? It's not only the start of the first. Yes, Judy is here. Yes, I got my yarn ready to go, Judy. But you know what? It's even better. It's even better because not only do I have a new mystery project to add to the pile of 15 knitting projects I already have going. This is actually a perfect day to start a mystery knit along because today is going to be a very, very, very special double feature on the cult. Now, earlier today, I came across a treasure trove of videos from Brown University. Yes, Ivy League Brown. And one of those videos is about, and there's a whole bunch of them. We're going to be watching a lot of videos from Brown University, I can tell you that. But one of those videos happened, well, a couple of weeks ago. Not even a couple of weeks, 7 days ago. Well, I guess it was uploaded 7 days ago, but it was happened very, very recently. Now, does anyone recognize this person? I recognize this person. This is Jules Gil-Peterson. We first encountered Jules Gil-Peterson when we watched Jules in an episode, I guess a while back, where Jules gave a lecture at Lewis and Clark College, where she encouraged college students to do it-yourself hormones For real. Now that sounds like a really good idea, doesn't it? But that was not actually the only place we've encountered Jules recently. I also encountered Jules at the Socialism Conference, where Jules was a speaker at the Socialism Conference. And in the Socialism Conference, when Jules was asked in a panel about the politics of childhood, what about the rights of child sex workers? Jules was like, well, if you want to advocate for the rights of child sex workers, then just get a couple friends and form a committee, and then you guys can all work together to advocate for child sex workers. That was Jules Gil-Peterson that was on the panel in which this crazy, like, child sex work activist was asking about the rights of child sex workers. No pushback, no mention of maybe children shouldn't be sex workers. There was none of that at the Socialism Conference. It was like, well, if you want to advocate for the rights of children to do this, then by all means form a little committee and you can do that. That was Jules Gil-Peterson. That is the same Jules Gil-Peterson that a couple of weeks ago gave a lecture at Brown University that you can see is on the official Brown University YouTube channel called Trans Youth Now. And I don't really know what it's going to be about because they didn't offer a description or anything. But when it comes to Jules Gil-Peterson, who is a socialist, also an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, a person that was lecturing at the Socialism 2023 conference on the politics of childhood, I suspect this is going to be crazy, okay? I suspect it's going to be a little, well, out there. So that's our first feature of today. But we got to get through this one quick. This is only an hour long. We should be able to get through it quick because just moments ago, I announced that there is a special supporter exclusive spy stream today, and it's going to start around 6:45. And it is going to be, I had to wait until the last minute to announce it because I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to get access to it until the very last minute. In fact, let me just double check. Yes, I do have access to it. I do. We're going to be watching a special supporter exclusive spy stream later today, starting at about 6:45. So what's going to happen, guys, is we're going to watch this first lecture by Jules Gil-Peterson. Again, it's going to take about an hour, and hopefully we will wrap up in time for spy stream to start. Now, what's going to happen is I'm going to end this video, and this is a public video, okay? And then for people who are supporters on Substack, YouTube channel membership, locals, or Patreon, you should all have access to the link to access the supporter exclusive spy streams. Now, there's a little bit of a snag today in that because I'm streaming right now on Rumble, I cannot set up the Rumble link for the supporter exclusive spy stream until this stream ends because Rumble is the crappiest streaming platform of all streaming platforms. They suck so badly for so many different reasons. Not the people on Rumble. I appreciate the people on Rumble. There's no shade on anyone watching on Rumble right now. I really do appreciate you guys. I just wish Rumble as a company would do a little bit more to maybe, I don't know, improve their platform and make it easier for people like me to actually use it. That'd be pretty great if they wanted to invest in that sometime. But anyway, I cannot set up the Rumble link until this stream is done. So my plan is I'm going to set up a Rumble link. I'm going to add it to the post on Substack. I just can't do it right now. So you do have access to the YouTube link. And I'm sorry, Rumble people, like you might just have to join the YouTube link if it's a quick turnaround or something like that. But at least the YouTube link will be available. But I do want to get it on Rumble. It is my goal to get it on Rumble. I just can't do it right now, okay? But we're going to do that. It's going to be amazing. We are a special double feature kind of day. And so we do have to hurry up today, guys, and get right into the stream. But I do just want to remind everyone, please make sure you are subscribed to my Substack. We had a great webinar last night called How to Speak Socialist. If you missed it, you can actually still access it I am going to be posting the recording officially to Substack, but you actually still can access it through the original link that I have posted on Substack. You can still access it through the on-demand download. And this was a great, like, almost 2.5 hour session. So many great questions were asked. I really appreciated it. I lost my voice. I barely could even make it until the end, but it was a really great webinar, and I hope that everyone had a chance to get signed up for it or get access to the recording on demand. I will be posting the link again to the on-demand recording on my Substack either tonight or tomorrow. It just depends on when I get around to it, but you can still access it for right now. And I'm really proud of this webinar. I want to be able to do this stuff again. Thank you to everyone who came out last night, and more information coming on that soon. And of course, that's the type of stuff that you get on my Substack that you really don't get anywhere else. Supporter exclusive spy streams into events and trainings that the far left is doing, exclusive reporting and access on things that no one else on the internet is covering. If you want to support the work I'm doing, please make sure you sign up as a supporter for $8 a month or $80 a year. I am completely 100% funded by you. I cannot do this without you guys. I really do appreciate the support. And yeah, make sure. And if you can't afford to right now, totally understand. That's fine. But at least make sure you're subscribed for free, because a lot of my content is free. Okay, I'm giving a lot of supporter exclusive perks, like 2 Zoom calls every single week, Bitchcraft calls, like supporter exclusive spy streams, stuff like that. But if you can only do free right now, that's totally fine. Just make sure you're sharing my work out there with people who appreciate it. And of course, that webinar that I did last night about how to speak socialist, that is available for free for everyone. And if you want to make a donation, that's fine. I really do appreciate it, but you don't have to. All right, guys. Let's dig right into it. John says, so I'm confused. So Jules is a Marxist, yes, but pushes hormones. Well, why wouldn't she? So when we talk about trans, is she talking about it in a non-socialist definition? Nope. So she's a queer activist, but also queer activists, when they use the term trans, they mean transcend or transform. They don't mean transition. Jules's goal is still to abolish the gender binary. She just she might say trans, but she doesn't mean transition. She means transcend or transform. So a little bit tricky there. All right, guys, let's jump right into it with our first feature of the day. We are going to be watching Jules Gil-Peterson, queer Marxist activist, lecture at Brown University about trans youth now. Please make sure you mount that like button for me. Let's get this party started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Contagion's Antonym, or 100 Years of Waiting. A special welcome to our speaker, Jules Gil-Peterson, and our moderator, Amira Lundy Harris. I'm Sarah Gamble. I use she and her pronouns, and I run the Pembroke Public Health
If you'd like to put your pronouns in the chat, please feel free to do so.
Center for Teaching and Research on Women. The goal of the collaborative is to bring together the fields of gender and sexuality studies and public health, and this fall we have a focus on trans youth. Trans Youth Now is a series of online events featuring prominent scholars in trans studies and trans health, speaking about existence and resistance in the anti-trans zeitgeist. I cannot think of a better person to kick off this series than Jules Gil-Peterson. A quick housekeeping note: we encourage you to submit questions for Professor Gil-Peterson using the Q&A function, and we'll address as many as we can in the time allotted. I'm going to briefly introduce our moderator.
Oh, hang on. Rose asks, how many children have to be sterilized before these freaks run out of children? They don't really care about that because they don't believe in upholding the gender binary or the biological nuclear family, so they don't really care. Rose wouldn't be so dismissive to call them freaks, because right now they're winning and they're kicking your ass. So what does it say about you that you're losing to a bunch of freaks?
Moderator, who will then introduce Jules. Amira Lundy Harris is the Nancy L. Buck Postdoctoral Fellow here at the Pembroke Center. They received their PhD in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies from the University of Maryland at College Park in 2023.
Of course they did.
And their BA in Black Studies and Sexuality, Women, and Gender Studies from Amherst College in 2016. Their current book project explores Black trans people's creation and cultivation of kinship bonds. I'm so delighted that Dr. Lundy Harris accepted my invitation to moderate this conversation, and I will now hand it over to them.
All right, thank you. My name is Mira, and I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Gil-Peterson today. Jules Gil-Peterson is an associate professor of history at Johns Hopkins University. This year, she's a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University. She's the author of
Harvard!
Histories of the Transgender Child, 2018, and a general co-editor at TSQ Transgender Studies Quarterly. Her next book, A Short History of Misogyny, will be published by Verso in January 2024.
Verso Books is socialist
Without further ado,
publisher.
welcome, Dr. Gil-Peterson.
Thanks so much, Amira, and thank you, Sarah, as well. So happy to be here. I'm, just over in Boston, so peering across to to Brown, but glad to be online, so more folks can join us today. And I'm really happy that this series is happening, particularly right now, and I'm honored to get to be the first installment. I'm looking forward to all the other talks to come.
So are we.
So I'm just going to dive right into it because I want to leave us as much time as possible in this hour for questions and for conversation. So this is Contagion's Antonym, or 100 Years of Waiting. The way trans healthcare is covered by journalists, let alone discussed on right-wing media or even social media, the public would be forgiven for thinking that it's a relatively straightforward process for anyone to gain access to the means of medical transition, including teenagers. And depending on your media diet, you might even think it were difficult to resist the pressure to transition, whether it be from peers or even from doctors or pharmaceutical companies. These chunks of disinformation form key components to the idea that being trans is socially contagious. As I've watched the idea explode in circulation and uptake with devastating results, I've also been keeping track of what passes for Contagion's antonym. Since the concept uses an epidemiological metaphor, treating trans people as a disease within the social body, understandably, its critics have largely produced what in the 19th century era of communicable diseases were called anti-contagions, rather elegantly, I think. You've probably seen these counter-arguments that being trans is not contagious at all, but rather a psychological property of the deep-rooted interior self, immune to outside influence, as well as the promotion of medicalization and especially psychological supervision as a reassuring check on any sociability to transness, particularly when it comes to young people. Obviously, having written a book detailing the lives and transitions of youth a century before this apparently new phenomenon became everyone's business, I've often wondered whether 100 years of young people being forced to wait to transition or deprived of the ability to transition would not be enough proof that social contagion is a fatuous, if not libelous, proposition.
Libelous.
Theories of social contagion and moral
much.
panics around children's gender and sexuality have such a long history that it would really be an entirely different lecture to even scratch their surface. But the specific concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria, through which social contagion is catapulted to new success, as I imagine a lot of you know, emerged only between 2016 and 2018. Let me briefly recap the chain of events. A blog called Fourth Wave Now, which endeavors to end gender-affirming care for youth, introduced the phrase in 2016 to invite parents of trans children to participate in a study by Lisa Littman, who was then an adjunct at Mount Sinai School of Medicine and later held a faculty position here at Brown in the School of Public Health before moving on to found a nonprofit corporation focused on detransition and conversion therapy. This original study also recruited parent participants from Transgender Trend and Youth Trans Critical Professionals, two other anti-trans organizations. Littman first published from this study in poster form in the Journal of Adolescent Health in 2017, followed by an article in PLOS ONE in 2018. That article was subject to such staggering professional criticism that the journal undertook a post-publication review a few weeks later. leading to a correction of the article, publishing a formal comment, and an apology. The correction in particular emphasized that Littman's study does not establish the existence of rapid onset gender dysphoria, but merely proposes it could be a rubric for future research. The study's total reliance on parents' reported subjective perceptions of their children, and even then, only parents from websites and organizations devoted to opposing gender affirming care, comprise the heart of its methodological weakness as a work of social science. Despite the correction and a series of much longer, more attentive critiques from scholars, many of which are peer-reviewed, the concept has had a massive political life. Indeed, its significance has only been acquired in a wider media ecology.
I just have a general question, and I wonder if anyone knows the answer. I'm specifically looking at you, Kurt, because I feel like you know everything about this stuff. Maybe I'm wrong. Might be giving you too much credit, but like, does anyone know when the process of like peer review started to get published in universities? Because I feel like it would be very easy if you're, say, trying to take over universities as a group of leftists to be able to control information, if you instituted a process that said the only credible information that ever gets published has to go through peer review so they can gatekeep anything that they don't want. Does anyone know when that actually started?
That I've been looking into over the past several years. One in which paranoid and conspiratorial ideas generated usually online and picked up often by far right and white supremacist groups are laundered into far more respectable venues by liberal institutions of journalism, political action groups, and elected officials.
Hang on. Kurt, why do you say the takeover of education was completed in 2013? What happened in 2013 specifically? I don't disagree with you. I think that that's probably right. I just wonder why you're pegging that time. Everyday Therapist says peer review existed in the 60s. I know it's been around a while. I just wonder, like, how did peer review start? Who came up with the idea? It's an interesting question.
This media ecology operates at a much vaster scale than anti-trans propaganda and reaches people far beyond the right wing, sustaining, among other
Jordan
things, the
Peterson and Heights cite that year.
anti-vaccination movement,
Okay.
anti-democracy
you.
conspiracies about the 2020 presidential election, and conspiracies about the COVID-19 pandemic, to name only a few. Opinion columns and journalism in papers of record began circulating the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria to varying degrees of honesty about the original study in 2017, which is also when a small cohort of psychologists began to cite it in their writing, including Kenneth
Kurt,
Sucker,
can you send me
whose
that link
Toronto
on Twitter,
clinic was
please?
shut down in 2015
Sorry,
around
I can't see it in the
allegations
chat.
of conversion therapy, and Ray Blanchard, best known for the outrageously sexualizing theory of autogynephilia. Freelance journalist Abigail Shire's book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, published in 2020, is also essentially a long-form articulation of the concept. According to Schreier, vague and unnamed forces intending the breakdown of American society are tricking vulnerable young girls into thinking they are transgender.
Well, yeah.
And finally, rapid onset gender
Thank you,
dysphoria
Kurt.
has also been integral to the political strategy of groups like the Alliance Defending Freedom and Republican state legislatures from the very first state law banning gender affirming care for young people, which passed in Arkansas in 2021. As of today, although the
John, this person is arguing against the very idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. So there are going to be, John, what you need to understand is that every single trans activist that has been dubbed a trans activist that you've heard from was not really a trans activist. They were a queer activist. This is because the queer ideology, queer is a far left political movement. It is not about being trans. Queer ideology hijacked the LGBT movement. They've been trying to do it for a while, but they really solidified it around 2015 when gay marriage was passed and there was no longer the need really for a gay rights movement because they had achieved what they wanted to achieve. Then the queer Marxists came in and hijacked it. So literally every single so-called trans activists that the right calls trans activists that you've heard from, if they weren't trans activists, they were queer activists, meaning a far left political ideology. And yeah, autogynephilia is a real thing. Absolutely.
Arkansas law has been permanently prevented from going into effect, over 20 states have passed similar laws, and several of them have been upheld in federal court going into effect. Now, the actual content of the concept here is profoundly weak, much like the methodology of the study. Littman contends to describe a distinct and new form of gender dysphoria, the vacuous diagnostic category presently employed for public and private insurance reimbursement, as well as clinical approval for medically gay-cab transition. The idea is essentially that when teenagers come out to their parents and quote unquote suddenly express a great deal of discomfort and a desire to transition, they are, one, doing something sudden instead of merely appearing to do so to their parents who didn't know they were trans before their child came out. And two, that this suddenness is different from some classical presentation of gender dysphoria, which either manifests at an incredibly young age or presents in adulthood, but somehow never in between.
Yeah, see, this is something that isn't really explained by the conservative right all that much. Lunel says that explains it. I was fully expecting the whole gay rights thing to quiet down once gay marriage was achieved, and that was very surprised when it didn't. Basically, what happened is like normal gay people like packed up and went home when gay marriage was achieved. They were like, "This is what we really wanted. This like we just want to live normal lives. Leave us alone." And then queer Marxists came in and saw an opportunity and hijacked the entire movement. This is why around, I think it was in 2015, 2016, you actually saw like there used to be gay straight alliances in school that started in like the late 90s. When I was in school, that was just all about like treating everyone well and not discriminating against gay people and stuff like that. Around 2015, 2016, I forget the exact year, but it was the same time that gay marriage was legalized. The gay straight alliances were literally renamed to be gender sexuality alliances. So they changed their entire focus. And I know this is really confusing to people because it has not really been explained by people who cover this stuff. But what happened again is like these people are always looking for power in any way that they can get it. And so they came in and they basically took over a movement and then continued to say, this is just about gay rights, trans rights, treating everyone well, gay rights, trans rights, treating everyone fairly, making the world a better place, when it wasn't about that at all. It was about pushing Marxism through this movement and using gender ideology to do so.
Both are fairly embarrassingly unfounded theories resting upon so many unverified assumptions that I actually think their weakness is very much the source of their political efficacy. The idea that parents are victims of their children's chronically online lives or a relativistic, permissive culture out of control substantiates a grievance politics in which particularly the figure of the white mother is besieged by forces seeking to destroy the family, or in the most
There it
extremist
is. Ironclad law of
manifestations
woke
of this theory that are
projection,
promoted
Jules.
by groups like the Proud Boys, the destruction of the white race. Now, there are granular, step-by-step.
As a reminder, Jules Gil-Peterson was literally a lecturer at the Socialism Conference in which they had several lectures talking about destroying the nuclear family. So when Jules Gil-Peterson is like, these crazy right-wingers think that we're out to destroy their family, that's bullshit. I'm sorry. This is specifically an area that I saw Jules Gil-Peterson lecture in person at the Socialism Conference when she was talking about the politics of childhood, which the politics of childhood is all about children's liberation, which is basically one of the things that they push to try to abolish the nuclear biological family. So bullshit, Jules.
Peer-reviewed criticisms of Littman's concept and study. If you're interested in those kinds of details, I highly recommend, in particular, Florence Ashley's piece in the Sociological Review monographs, which was entitled A Critical Commentary on Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria, published in 2020. But I actually don't want to retread the ground of those critiques because I want to raise a different scale of critique and suggest something a little different from most of ROGD's critics. The concept has been profoundly successful.
Yes, and this is an important point, and it's not just anti-LGB; it's also anti-T. By the way, it's anti anything that upholds the gender binary. So it's not just anti-LGB, but it is true that this movement has a concept called homonormativity, it basically means gay people like settling down and getting married and having kids just like straight people. These people don't like homonormativity because the entire goal of queer theory, queer Marxism, critical queer theory, whatever you want to call it, whatever it's being called on any given day, the entire goal is to destabilize the system, to go against the norm. That's what queer is, and they're doing it specifically to abolish the gender binary. So if gay people just get married and settle down and have kids like any normal couple would do, that does not go against the norm, and that's why they kind of have a little slur for it called homonormativity, which they consider to be a bad thing.
Politically, precisely to the
Got a super chat coming in from Murphy's Pool. Was the high-profile transition of Caitlyn Jenner a catalyst which the left took advantage of in 2015? Oh, no. Caitlyn Jenner is very inconvenient for the left because Caitlyn Jenner is a conservative. And the fact that conservatives shit on Caitlyn Jenner so much is so stupid. Caitlyn Jenner could have been such a strong ally and a resource in fighting back against these people, because these people hate Caitlyn Jenner. Because as a reminder, guys, queer is not about being trans. Queer doesn't care if you're trans. Queer doesn't care if you're cis. Queer doesn't care if you're gay. Queer doesn't care if you're straight. Queer doesn't care about any of these things. Queer is a far left political ideology. That is all it is. And so Caitlyn Jenner does not ascribe to the far left political ideology, and therefore these people are not really big fans of Caitlyn Jenner because she's considered to be the enemy. It doesn't matter that she's trans. Caitlyn Jenner has no issues with capitalism and the family. No issues at all. Can this cult be completely eradicated? Nope. Absolutely not. Especially not the way conservatives are behaving right now. Conservatives make these people stronger every single day. So the way we're going, nope, they're going to be around a long time.
Extent that it functions rather irrationally, reinforcing the feelings of people already libidinally invested in anti-trans narratives, including those who feel genuine animosity towards their own trans children. And for that reason, I'm actually quite skeptical
Just argue
of
that
the impulse
conservative
to
parents are
criticize
dangerous
rapid
to their
onset
children.
gender dysphoria as junk science or pseudoscience. Not because Littman's study or the concept as it circulates aren't poor quality social science. I agree. I think they're exceptionally poorly conceived and very badly executed. But that weakness, as I'm suggesting, is actually key to its effectiveness. In other words, social contagion theory is fairly tactically immune to debunking, precisely because it is both conspiratorial and sentimental rather than factual. I think also construing social contagion as pseudoscience pushes it outside the charmed circle of proper science, and especially the field of gender-affirming care, as if they were one another's antithesis. And for me, this touches on a broader concern I have right now.
Again, John, you're not listening. I need you to listen, okay? This is not about the LGB, because the T is not these people either. Trans and queer are not the same thing. They're not the same thing. So I like, anytime it has to be LGBT, and you want to separate the Q. The Q is the problem, okay?
Now about what I might call the reactionary liberalism and intense idealization of science and medicalization that are flourishing as flaccid responses to openly authoritarian and openly fascist anti-trans political movements. The reaction, which you've
Fascist
probably
means
seen
anti-capitalist.
the slogan, it's just
pro-capitalist, rather.
healthcare, or in the case of young people, that this is a matter that ought to be left to cautious parents and clinicians, tends to rationalize, if not outright alibi, a horrific status quo. The defensive liberalism that is presently codifying and reinforcing as best practices an indefensible and intolerable medical system,
Socialists hate liberalism,
actually agrees with proponents of social contagion, insofar as their sober motive for gender-affirming care is to slow people down, to get in the way of their desires, and ultimately to interfere with the minimum degree of self-determination that is how you make use of your own body, all in the name of preventing hypothetical future regret. Worst of all, I'm not convinced that the scientific and clinical anchors of gender-affirming care even run contrary to the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria, or are much more empirically rooted. In fact, speaking as a historian, it stands out to me that the zealous citation of the concept comes mostly from an older generation of clinicians like Zucker and Blanchard, as well as, for instance, the New York Times obsession with presenting a debate among clinicians and scientists over the standards of care. All of which suggests to me that what everyone is anxiously or deliberately avoiding, albeit for different reasons, is the profound conservatism and manifest harm of trans medicine to trans people. To outline what I mean, I'll offer a brief example of how trans medicine has long understood its mission to be epidemiological. That is, medicine serves an intentionally social function of trying to limit the spread of transition in the population. And I'll use that to come back at the end to the question of what to do with this poison pill concept. I think the long century of youth waiting to transition that—
Hang on, Gloria's got a question. Do you think that there is going to be a backlash as the kids who are getting trans treatment now become adults, or is there already a plan for the left to deal? Oh, I mean, Gloria, did you see the spy stream we did last week in that in like the trans activism training where they say that guy actually, well, I don't know. So I haven't released this. I don't think I've released. No, I did release this clip. This is on the Substack. The guy in the trans activism training last week literally said that most detransitioners are grateful to have transitioned, and it was just another part of their exploration of their own gender. And those pesky ones that are on Fox News, don't worry about them. That's just onesies and twosies. So the thing of it is there is not a high enough quantity of people speaking out against this stuff. Conservatives seem to think there's a lot of people doing it just because they see a lot of people talking about it on TV. But like, how many times have you seen Chloe Cole? Chloe Cole's one person. Chloe Cole can go on as many radio shows, do as many podcasts as she wants. She's one person, right? There's not a critical mass of people speaking out against this stuff. So I don't really think it's gonna do too much to impact them. Are there efforts by the LGBT to distance themselves from the Q? Are they aware of the Q agenda? Some of them, most of them not. And again, I have to blame conservative influencers for this because conservative influencers have really misinformed their audience. Conservative influencers are more interested in hating trans people than they are in accurately relaying information about what's going on. And so, no, I don't think there is a large effort in this because most people are demonizing trans people rather than actually focusing on what the issue is, which is queer being a far left political ideology. And until conservative influencers stop lying to their audiences about what's going on, either because they are willfully misinformed, or because they just haven't done the homework, or because they're just lying because it makes money for conservative content creators to hate on trans people. Until that changes, then this isn't going to change because conservatives are riling up their audience and making them think trans people are the problem when they're not the problem. They're not the problem at all. This is socialist speak, Rose. Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, there are lawsuits, but that doesn't really, I mean, again, it's like those, you guys understand, right? Those lawsuits are probably going to settle out of court, which means there's going to be no legal precedent. That's what happens every single time is conservatives celebrate the lawsuits. The lawsuits are good. Don't get me wrong. I'm a fan of the lawsuits because the lawsuits cost people money, but there's not going to be any legal precedent. Those lawsuits are going to get settled out of court.
I've written about in my book may be social contagion's antonym, but then again, the more disturbing possibility is that they may not be at all. So, before renaming itself the World Professional Association for Transgender Health in 2007, the organization that invented the standards of care went by the far less pronounceable acronym HBIGDA. The
Oh.
Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association was formed in 1977, and it took its name from a physician and endocrinologist who began working with trans patients in the late 1940s. Harry Benjamin immigrated to the United States from Germany at the outset of World War I. He was a contemporary of both Sigmund Freud and Magnus Hirschfeld, whose Berlin clinic for trans people was destroyed by the...
So you're telling me the guy that started the organization that later became WPATH, which is the world organization that like regulates trans whatever, the guy that started that organization was really into Freud? You don't say. Why is it important that that guy was really into Freud? Does anyone know what the meaning is there? Any ideas? Any ideas at all why it might be important that that guy was really into Freud? Any idea? Because socialists are obsessed with Freud. Now, not everyone that likes Freud is a socialist, but socialists are obsessed with Freud. They fucking... So that's like an indicator. It's not, again, not everyone that likes Freud is socialist, but an awful lot of socialists really like Freud.
Nazis. Benjamin shifted his New York City and San Francisco practices to patients that he began calling transsexuals in the early 1950s. He started to publish in medical journals and lecture on a general approach to hormone therapy and surgeries, the one that is still in use today.
Freud was part of
In
the Frankfurt School,
1952,
Trendelin.
the worldwide fame of Christine Jorgensen, an American who had traveled to Denmark for surgery, supercharged Benjamin's when she engaged him as her personal doctor and public ally. Their names appeared together in the press, flooding his office with requests for help. And so by the early 1960s, Benjamin was poised to consolidate all this attention into a new medical specialty. He convened a working group of like-minded clinicians to share patients and harmonize their clinical work. Reed Erickson, a wealthy trans businessman from Louisiana, privately funded their work with $2.4 million of his own dollars over the next decade and a half. Benjamin's approach was the literal blueprint for H-Bigda and later WPATH. And although he wasn't its only architect, he was instrumental in authoring the gatekeeping model, where strict diagnostic criteria intentionally exclude most people from transitioning. Of course, medical transition itself was not new in the 1950s. What was new was the desire of clinicians to professionalize, which meant they needed to produce credentials and authority for themselves. And because trans people experienced ongoing discrimination, criminalization, poverty, and political persecution, working with them could potentially diminish those clinicians' careers. But Benjamin and his peers felt the risk was worth it. By obtaining access to trans people as research subjects, they hoped to find proof of what made everyone...
Hang on, this type of stuff is not useful here. I understand this type of stuff. It happens on a lot of channels other than this one where not serious business is conducted. But we're actually trying to learn here, and I don't co-sign this. I don't care if people are trans, and quite frankly, I don't think the trans-hating garbage actually is productive at all. I think every time you guys do this stuff, these people win. So if you want to keep losing to these people, keep going, but I don't allow this shit here. I'm going to ask you to stop. There's a reason I'm not on any hate watch lists, and that's because I don't care if people are trans. It is none of my business. Everyone deserves basic respect and dignity to be referred to how they want to be referred to, and as long as they aren't using it as a power play over me, I don't care.
Into men and women. This was, of course, the approach medical science already took to treating homosexuality. Assigning a stigmatized minority the label of disorder or pathology allowed researchers to reverse engineer the prototypically normal person. So studying trans people, in short, was meant to explain everyone else's gender. Of course, the inconvenient problem was that trans people exhibited no physiological differences from the rest of the population. The only thing that made them different, their desire to transition, was the only real measure of what counted as being trans. For physicians like Benjamin trained to rely on biological data, this was an intolerable situation. The last thing he wanted to do was accept trans people's requests for hormones and surgery at face value, deflating his professional authority. After all, what prestige would await a medical specialty that couldn't even distinguish its patient pool from the general population? In the absence of biological criteria, Benjamin and his colleagues needed to invent a diagnosis for transsexualism that could pass for authoritative in the eyes of his
Freud
peers.
had something to do with the Frankfurt School. I read somewhere Freud had something to do with the Frankfurt School. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure Freud had something to do with it. I could be wrong. But whatever, it doesn't really matter, to be honest, because like these people distort all ideologies to use them for their purpose. What I know is that if someone really likes Freud, like alarm bells are going off in my head to be like, what else do you really like that I don't think is a good idea? William says, I watched your webinar on learning socialist speak, and it is by far the most important video I've ever watched. It really opened my eyes a lot. You mind if I share that with family and friends? William, I don't mind if you share it with family and friends at all. I made it free for a reason. I want people to share the information. If you haven't seen it, it is available on demand now. I will be posting a direct link on my Substack either tonight or tomorrow for people who didn't get signed up for it the first time. But please do share it. We need to be teaching the people this stuff. I appreciate it. And yes, my dogs are making themselves known. Thank you, Max. It's good to see you.
Solution to this dilemma would go on to cast a very long shadow. So when H. Big Dub published the first Standards of Care in 1979, their signature gatekeeping regime involved a requirement almost unheard of in most clinical medicine. Trans people were required to submit to long-term psychological supervision, psychiatric diagnosis, and written approval to access medications and surgeries for their physical bodies, not their minds. Everyone else, meanwhile, could obtain hormones and plastic surgeries directly. The Standards of Care stipulated that hormone prescriptions.
James Jones says, from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, since the beginning of psychoanalysis, the Frankfurt School was conceived in terms of a reinterpretation of Freud. So that must be it then. That must be it. I knew that Freud had something to do with the Frankfurt School, but I wasn't sure what. John, that is exactly correct. Exactly right. Well done. This is how they achieve their goals. They want to focus on the T instead of the Q and just keep people fighting. Every single time that conservatives talk about how much they hate trans people and they are calling trans people the wrong pronouns, and they're saying, you're wearing woman face, and they're attacking Dylan Mulvaney and Jeffrey March, every single time it is just a distraction from what's really going on. And then these people use it against them to say, look at all these right-wing bigots. Look at all these right-wing bigots. We told you they're the bigots that we told you they were. And then these people use it to lure people away from even considering anything to do with the right, because they come across extremely hateful and toxic. They really do. So this is exactly correct. The focus needs to be on the Q, not on the T. And we need to make sure people know the difference. Not all trans people are queer. I mean, in fact, most of them aren't queer. It is the queer Marxists, the queer activists that we need to be worried about.
Required one psychiatric approval letter, which could be granted only after.
Yes, please keep all trans hating to yourself. I do appreciate it. And I would highly recommend you cut that shit out in general.
Clinicians, and only after at least 1 year of continuous therapy. This psychiatric mandate codified a practice that the first gender clinics in the US at Johns Hopkins Hospital and Stanford University had already been employing for well over a decade. The architects of those clinics had developed this psychiatric gatekeeping with Benjamin. But strangely, from the outset, they all conceded that there was no test available to determine if an individual was genuinely trans, nor was there a single effective psychiatric or psychotherapeutic intervention that could treat trans people, which for them would mean eliminating the need to transition. And this was not a quiet admission whispered behind closed doors. It was printed in medical journals and discussed at conferences open.
These issues are coming from queer Marxists. They are coming from queer Marxists specifically to destabilize the gender binary. It's the queer Marxists that you're worried about. They're not from trans people. This is a result of conservative influencers conflating trans people and queer people.
Openly as the cornerstone of diagnosis from the 1950s onward. That is to say, in diagnosing transsexuals, the goal was not to determine if the patient was objectively trans. Instead, psychiatric gatekeeping had the practical effect of delaying a person's access to transition, sometimes for years. And the function of therapy.
Guys, let me just lay it out really as clearly as I possibly can, okay? Like every single crazy thing you see around gender is not coming from normal trans people. It is coming from queer activists. The reason that you think it's coming from trans people is that your influencers, the people who have the biggest platforms, who have been talking about this stuff all over, don't know the difference between trans and queer because they're either stupid or they're lying or they are willfully misinformed because they don't do basic research into what they talk about. They have misinformed millions of people of what is going on. Every single thing that you guys are blaming trans people on, it is not normal trans people doing it. It is queer Marxists that are doing it. We have got to stop conflating the terms trans and queer. These are two completely different things. This is something that I talked about in my How to Speak Socialist webinar yesterday. This is something I've covered extensively on the Substack. This is something I feel like I repeat every single day on my YouTube channel, but these are two different things and we need to start treating them as such. The machine says, I've watched a lot of your videos and I've learned a lot. I did not know how bad it was until I found your videos. You're welcome. Thank you for your hard work. I do have a book. It's called Actively Unwoke, the ultimate guide for fighting back against the woke insanity in your life. It is available at activelyunwoke.com. Amazon is probably the best place to get it. Hardcover, Kindle version, audio version. And it's kind of like intro to like the woke left ideology. I don't dive deep into the socialism stuff, although it is mentioned because I wrote the book 2 years ago. But I do have it. I recommend it. I appreciate everyone who picks it up. But again, make sure you're subscribed to my Substack too, because the Substack, carlin.substack.com, is going to have all the latest stuff. I appreciate it. Well, they're all queer. They're all queer. All of them are queer. There is a difference between trans and queer. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to say this today.
During that time period was to subjectively assess how well a patient could be
It's cool, man.
to
It's cool. I'm just asking you to listen and to acknowledge that there's a difference between trans and queer. They're two different things. They're not what you think they are. This is not the left. Again, guys, you've got to stop conflating everyone on the left together. John says there is a culture class the left wants. Some people go about their life as though there are more than two genders. Other have no concept of it. So okay, maybe I read that a little bit wrong. My bad. But like the queer activists want to abolish gender entirely. It's not that they want more than two genders. It's that they want to abolish gender entirely. The difference between trans and queer is that trans, as in transition, upholds the gender binary. If you're transitioning from a man to a woman or a woman to a man, you uphold the gender binary because you're saying there are two different genders and there are man and woman. And it doesn't matter that you're transitioning between the two because you're still saying there are two different and distinct genders. Queer is a far left political ideology that wants to abolish gender entirely. When queer people use the term trans, they don't mean transition. They mean transform or transcend, as in transform gender, transcend gender. They want to get rid of gender entirely. Normal trans people don't want to get rid of gender entirely. They just want to live their life in the way that they feel most comfortable, and that's how they need to do it. That's the difference. Do they uphold the gender binary, which upholds the normal, upholds the current system, upholds capitalism, these people would say, or did they want to abolish the gender binary? Abolishing the gender binary is a direct attack on capitalism, is a direct attack on the nuclear family. This is why you see so many non-binary people running around. Any non-binary person is going to fall under queer. The definition of queer is that it goes against the normal. Queer theory is designed to destabilize the normal. The way they're doing that is by trying to abolish all gender. So if someone believes that there are men and there are women, they are a friend. They are an ally. That's someone, and it doesn't matter if they're trans or not. If someone believes that we can abolish gender entirely and create a world full of theys and non-binary people, they are a socialist. They are a queer Marxist. They are in a cult. That's the difference. Do you uphold the gender binary or do you want to abolish the gender binary? That is the question that we should be asking about people. Not if they're trans, not if they have woman face, none of this crap, none of the conservative crap. Leah Thomas is documented to be a queer activist. It's documented.
Conform to cultural and social norms. And I don't mean here only norms of gender. Stanford's clinic, which opened in 1968 under the direction of Donald Laub, who would be a future president of HBIGDA, named this principle rehabilitation. During a 1 year and sometimes longer real-life test, in which patients were sent out to survive in the world without access to full medical transition, they were also expected to enroll in a program that would rehabilitate them into productive women and men. Models were hired to teach beauty ideals of clothing, makeup, and bodily comportment to women, and the clinic pressured patients to pick gender stereotype lines of work and strictly avoid some of the only ways they could make money.
Exactly. Very well done. These people think that you cannot achieve equity until you abolish gender. You can't achieve gender equity until there's no more gender. That's exactly right. The queer is abolishing gender is the ultimate expression of equity. Everyone is the same. And that means Marxism. Equity means Marxism. Well done.
Like dancing, performing drag, or doing sex work. Psychologists, meanwhile, appointed themselves the task of verifying that patients were exclusively heterosexual, wanting only normal marriage after surgery. Failure to live up to any of these demands could mean expulsion from the clinic or being placed on hold for years at a time. And while hormones had their own available DIY market, most surgery did not. By Laub's own estimate in 1972, of 500 prospective patients at Stanford, just 25 had been judged rehabilitated and granted surgery. The Hopkins Clinic in Baltimore had an even worse record. In its first 2 years open, 2,000 people applied and 24 were approved for surgery. But these staggering numbers were signs of success, according to clinicians. Stanford psychiatrist Norman Fiske was able to tout a 100% positive outcome rate in a 5-year follow-up study published in 1974, simply because the clinic rejected over 90% of the people who came to them, only selecting the cases they felt were the most docile and conforming. And these rejections, once again, weren't because patients were tested and found out not to be trans. No, it was that they didn't pass well enough according to a psychiatrist. They weren't judged attractive enough by a surgeon. They weren't submissive enough to their doctors. They weren't unambiguously heterosexual, or they didn't have middle-class professional aspirations. This heavy hand of psychiatric supervision was a powerful way to constrict trans people's freedoms, but it served one other aim I want to mention: liability. When Benjamin first sought out collaborators in the mid-1950s, he partnered with Elmer Belt, a Los Angeles-based plastic surgeon. Belt was having a real practical problem with his trans patients. Conservative hospital boards had begun to deny him access to operating rooms, claiming they were uncertain over the legality of operating on healthy tissues and the possibility of law.
Hang on. I don't mind you asking questions, okay? As long as you're listening. Yes, Jazz Jennings would not be a queer activist because Jazz Jennings is a victim of their parents. Jazz Jennings is a victim of a mother that obviously and clearly has Munchausen's by proxy. Jazz Jennings didn't do anything wrong. Jazz Jennings was born into a cult. And I think it's more about the mother being mentally ill and wanting attention and having Munchausen by proxy than it is about her being a queer activist. I think it's about attention seeking.
Lawsuits. But actually, in the 1950s, plastic surgery overall was considered rather dubious by many medical professionals.
Hang on. The machine is asking a great question because this is his first time here. Is it okay to be confused by some of this? It seems like a different language. Yes, it is, the machine. Yes, it is. And I would definitely recommend that you check out. Let me just pop the link in the chat. I recommend that you check out my webinar that I did last night, and you can find the recording on demand now in the link that I'm about to put in the chat. And this is like an introductory lesson for how to speak socialist, because you are absolutely right. There's the link in the chat. If you want to sign up for that, just follow the link. I know it happened yesterday, but you can still access it on demand. I will put this in the chat on Rumble as well. Tom After Dark on Rumble says, no offense, but is Carlin gay? No, I fucking love dick. My husband's got a great one. I'm very lucky. Anyway, sign up for the webinar. It's totally free to access it. It's about 2.5 hours long, lots of questions, and that'll break down how to speak socialist and give you a good introduction. It is perfectly normal to be confused. It is an incredibly overwhelming topic. Okay. It's very complicated, and it is another language. So I hope you stick around for a while, machine. I will immerse you in this culture. You'll learn how to speak socialist before you know it. And that is when the fun really begins. Thank you for the question. Well, no, this is not why they're doing it. They're not doing it because they don't believe in objective reality. They do it because they have completely different values and different things that they believe the world should be than you do. This is a right-wing talking point. This is not a left-wing talking point. Hang on, I'm scrolling through the chat to see if anyone else had any questions. Because parts of these webinars, guys, honestly, it's not always about what these people are saying, because this person hasn't said anything crazy yet. That doesn't mean they won't. This person is insane. But I like answering questions in the chat and using it to like facilitate questions. And I think we have some good discussions that actually like add to the value of having to sit through a boring presentation. So I just want to make sure I had all the questions answered. Yeah. Okay. Hang on. Let's keep going.
Especially other surgeons, because it didn't necessarily cure any physiological disease. Surgeries for trans people seem to be the strongest proof for that conservative attitude. So Benjamin and Belt landed on the idea of using psychiatric letters to indemnify both the surgeon and the hospital. And Benjamin also began applying this principle in his private practice, finding that psychiatrists could act as barriers between him and patients, weeding out anyone who might challenge the quality of his medical practice or, more importantly to him, his authority. So in other words, patient regret did matter.
Hang on. Tom After Dark on Rumble, I have some bad news for you, bro. Tom After Dark on Rumble says, I really dig the Gays Against Groomers, folks. My only gay buddy ain't having Gays Against Groomers as an organization. Wah, wah. Gays Against Groomers is a corrupt, grifting organization. I've reported on them extensively on my Substack. Jamie Mitchell is a goddamn psychopath. Gays Against Groomers had a mass exodus of volunteers at the beginning of the year because Jamie Mitchell was such a goddamn nightmare that it wasn't tenable. Like, it really is like, it is honestly one of the worst grifting organizations in the conservative space. I like the theory behind it. I do. But the execution is not good, and I really don't recommend you give them any money at all because it's going right into Jamie Mitchell's pocket.
But it's not the kind of regret we hear about in the media today. Benjamin and Belt were worried that trans people would regret trusting them with their medical care and perhaps sue them or retaliate for substandard care. And the earliest inklings of this arrangement actually appeared decades earlier in the late 1930s when some of the first trans people traveled to places like Johns Hopkins to request surgeries that at the time were only used to force intersex people to appear male and female. Hugh Hampton Young, head of the urology department at Hopkins, met with some of these trans people and was very anxious that they showed no physiological difference from so-called normal people and they weren't intersex. So when a trans man from Alabama named Bernard impressed Young with a medically literate request for top and bottom surgery, Young sent him over to a colleague in psychiatry, Thomas Rennie. And that psychiatrist then issued a long, rambling letter dismissing Bernard as some sort of vague homosexual.
What about Blair White? Massive fucking grifter. Yeah, I do not. Blair White is a massive, massive, massive grifter that basically has scripts written for her by other people. And just like, I mean, really effing horrible. Like, I mean, honestly, it's just like what Blair White cares about. And I've met Blair White on several occasions. I'm not just pulling this out of my ass here. What Blair White cares about is looking pretty and wearing pretty clothes and having pretty things and all this stuff and having and using the internet to make more than enough money. And you know what? I don't begrudge her like internet success and money and fame and all that stuff. But if you're following Blair White, expecting her to understand any of this, she is fully not capable of it. Yeah, Blair White just wants money. That's fine. That's fine. Just be honest about it. Go start a merchandise line or a makeup line or something. Don't try to act like a smart kid. You're not. Sorry.
But the letter had the practical effect of discouraging Bernard, sending him packing from Hopkins. So, for over 80 years,
I love it when people ask me to
role
spill the
of
tea on people.
psychiatrists in trans medicine has been to protect the reputation of doctors and surgeons.
Because I don't suffer any of these
Rather
assholes.
than minimizing future regret for accidental transitioners, the gatekeeping model has had rather the opposite effect. It has intentionally stopped many trans people from being able to transition and slowed down even more by forcing them to wait sometimes for years. HBIGDA organized its standards of care around precisely this gatekeeping principle, most of which still remains in effect today, now under the banner of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is the new version of HBIGDA.
Well, Lunal says, isn't it good to have trans people speak out against this stuff? Sure. It's fine. It's great to have trans people speak out about this stuff. But let's not pretend these people are in it for anything more than money. These people will, guys, here's the deal with most content creators on the internet. I'm not most content creators on the internet. They will say whatever they have to make money. That's it. That's all they're doing. They just want your wallet. That's it. And so, I mean, again, is there anything wrong with that? I mean, I'm a capitalist. No, do whatever you want. But I think it's good to have trans people speak out against this stuff. But there are a lot of trans people in the world that are against this. And the only trans person that conservatives seem to like is Blair White. Why aren't conservatives lifting up every single trans person speaking out against this stuff? Because there are a lot of them, but you never hear from them because Blair White is so pretty. We only want Blair White. Blair White is the only trans person that matters. Like, seriously, it's about image. That's all it is. Carlin, do you dig Derek Jensen, Tom After Dark? I don't know who that is, but maybe I can look into him.
As well as in private insurance reimbursement policies and state Medicaid
Yasmin, you should totally grift on Twitter.
As my book details, the predisposition of trans medicalization to delay, interfere, and gatekeep redoubled in the way clinicians treated trans children and teenagers, who they saw through an additional developmental lens. Harry Benjamin's office, for instance, would reply to letters written by trans youth asking for help in the 1960s and 70s with a very simple instruction: wait. The medical age of consent, of course, kept Benjamin from taking on as patients any children without parental consent. But the admonition also, I think, had a greater significance. Waiting to transition was presented as an endurance test for youth.
Here we go.
To prove a young person's deservingness to transition.
Okay, so now we've hit and I know we've kind of been ignoring the lecture because it's been boring and she hasn't really been saying anything. We just hit the jackpot. Do you know what this person is about to argue? Is that, isn't it awful that waiting to transition was made into an endurance test? Isn't it awful that these young people were put through an endurance test in order to transition? Let's just go back. We need to pay attention now. No more gossiping in the chat.
Children without parental consent. But the admonition also, I think, had a greater significance. Waiting to transition was presented as an endurance test for youth, a means to prove a young person's deservingness to transition if they could only manage to survive into adulthood waiting. And of course, many trans youth rejected entirely the commandment to wait as intolerable and untenable, turning the discourse of child development back on the doctor. As just one 18-year-old trans girl explained to Benjamin in a letter in 1965, quote, "I wanted to have an operation like this for several years, and now is as
So
good a
since you
time
were
as
11,
any. I don't want to wait until I'm growing old. I want to be a girl on my way to old age. I want to be a girl now so that I can grow up the rest of the way as a normal girl," end quote. So all of this brings me back to the question of why we actually might need contagion to defend trans people and not only its antonym. Now, I don't mean to suggest we need contagion as a disease metaphor, which obviously has a repugnant history of serving the eugenics movement, colonial atrocities and genocides, including the Holocaust. What we need is to de-dramatize trans childhood and admit that gender is not a psychological inner property, but profoundly, utterly social, an attribute of the self only insofar as we are social beings.
so gender
might
is a social
resonate in
construct?
American culture as something we fantasize is on the inside of the self, but in practice, it is largely given to us by strangers in the shared world.
So you're
To
saying
learn
gender
to
is a
want
social
trans youth to
construct?
be in the world, to learn to want trans childhood, as the end of my book prescribed, means, I think, in a value sense, to really want in the abstract transition to spread, rather than to always anxiously contain it. I'm taking a cue here from Arne Zura and Cass Adair, who've written thoughtfully in a recent issue of Transgender Studies
Yeah.
Quarterly about the importance
And remember, guys, if you missed this, this was a supporter exclusive, but I released clips of this on my Substack. We watched a trans activist training last week in which the trans activist literally argued that it is better for kids to transition before their brain is developed because they know who they really are before their brain is fully developed. And after their brain is fully developed, they might talk themselves out of being trans. That's all on my Substack. You guys can go and find it. John says this comes back to kids being private property of the parents in their view. If kids are not private property, then they should be able to do what they want at any time. Bingo, John. Socialists are like Scientologists in that they believe that children are but adults in little bodies that can make all their own decisions. And it's the job of the socialists to liberate children from their parents because children really know what's best for them and they can make all their own decisions for themselves. Well done, John. You are listening. I'm going to give you a little credit. You are listening. All right.
Sometimes leaning into the contagious gendering of trans masculinity, so catastrophized.
Oh, Pinky, this is going to blow your mind. If gender is a social construct, why the medicalization? Is that to sterilize them and to help abolish the family? Not exactly. In the introduction to the book Transgender Marxism, they literally say that having surgery, making a physical commitment to being trans is the ultimate act of commitment to the far left political ideology. So the act of medicalization, the act of making permanent changes to your body is the ultimate commitment to queer the far left political ideology because you are making you're making permanent change to your body to adhere to the ideology.
By Abigail Schreier and company. I've also offered a public critique of a popular graph you may have seen showing rates of left-handedness in the population before and after left-handed people were subjected to coercive correction. It's a graph that shows the rate of left-handedness going up and then plateauing. But I've critiqued that precisely because the analogy arrogantly presumes to tell us that there is a natural, consistent, indeed preordained amount of trans people in the world to which we must bow and carefully, if not anxiously, police the boundaries of. But how could we possibly know such a thing? And what a pitiable value
Transgender
that kind of
Marxism.
thinking assigns to being trans. We have no idea how many trans people there are or could be, and rationalizing the proper demography of any minority group will only ever redound into eugenic arithmetic anyways. So I say let's dispense with the pretense altogether. And I think if we were to do so, we may finally find ourselves poised to charge social contagion's single biggest promoter for the idea's disastrous returns. And I don't mean Lisa Littman, I mean the WPATH brand of institutionalized trans medicine that has succeeded in a brilliant PR
Look at that color
strategy
green.
to
Isn't
rebrand
that pretty?
itself as the premier organ of gender's
Ooh.
affirmation, which it surely is not, and has exploited the political crisis bearing down on trans people to entrench a legally recognized and private insurance market regulated role as the custodians of
Yes.
trans people's bodies and psyches. Breaking the medicalized monopoly on trans people's autonomy, especially on youth, will require nothing less than a socially contagious transformation in the body politic, one whose form we probably cannot really anticipate at this moment. And I'm sort of sorry to say this, but not really, that I think sometimes in their melodramas and moral panics about youth transition, the right is somewhat more honest about its deep-seated fear of such transformations in the body politic than those preaching the sober, self-limiting mission of trans inclusion. Thank you so much for listening. Looking forward to your questions.
For those who are new here, now, I know the first part of this was a little bit boring. We were talking more in the chat than we were actually like picking pieces out. But the most important part of any socialist lecture is the Q&A, because in the first part, they're reading off of a prepared statement. In the second part, when they're taking Q&A, they have to go off the cuff and they say the quiet part out loud a whole lot more. Gloria, is the queer Marxist goal that everyone would come to a realization that everyone is not trans in Nina's transcending. Yes, transcending. That everyone is okay, let me start again. Is the queer Marxist goal that everyone would come to a realization that everyone needs to transcend the gender binary? Yes. That is their goal. To abolish gender entirely. And in order to abolish gender, what needs to happen is everyone needs to come to the realization that we are all queer and that we don't need gender. The gender binary was created by capitalism. I explained why in my webinar last night. The gender binary was created by capitalism because capitalism created oppressive gender roles that put women in the house doing unpaid labor to raise the family and men outside the house doing other things. Anyway, guys, we got to speed this up because we got half an hour left before the next stream. Let's keep going. Sorry. I'm on a schedule.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jules, for this fruitful and thought-provoking talk.
I didn't realize it was already 6:17.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with just like one or two, and so that we can have some time for community questions, which I hope is going to be the focus. Okay, so the first question, you sort of gesture towards it or touch on it at the end, but I'm hoping you could talk a little bit more about like what are the stakes of us reframing our thinking around institutional medicine's relationship to transition.
Check the Substack, guys. We're doing a spy stream at 6:45, impromptu spy stream at 6:45. All the information's on the Substack or in Locals or whatever platform you're a supporter on.
In this way, or I guess what possibilities does it open up, or sort of paraphrasing you, why we might actually need contagion to defend trans people.
Yeah, you know, it's really sort of this question that's emerged for me in the past few years, watching how understandably defensive, right, and reactionary pro-trans mobilization has had to be, in part because of the escalation of anti-trans political violence. I'm not trying to minimize that, of course. It's proceeded at a kind of dizzying pace, the degree of harm being enacted by law, but also the kind of extrajudicial violence that we're seeing occur, on an increasing basis is something that, is sort of, I think, led to this kind of battening down of the hatches, right? And even unintentionally, this kind of rallying around the most conservative possible defense of trans people, which is the medical model. And of course, some of that's just tactical when you have state laws, quite literally criminalizing that medical model. But part of what concerns me there is, again, not just that I think the medical model itself disapproves of transition and tries to limit it in precisely the way these, partisans of rapid onset gender dysphoria would suggest, but also that institutions like WPATH have actually become unaccountable, unelected layers of government, right? Just to say it, WPATH is a voluntary professional organization, right? It's like me going to the American Historians
Isn't that
Association annual
interesting? She
meeting,
doesn't like
right?
WPATH.
This isn't like
Isn't that
some
interesting?
amazing organization that serves some higher purpose. It's for doctors and clinicians, psychiatrists and psychologists to advance their careers, right? And there was very, very, very little trans involvement in its advent. At the time when the first standards of care were produced, there were like 3 or 4 trans people who were members of HBIGDA, right? And that number didn't really budge for many decades. And so WPATH has managed to produce itself as a kind of layer of government in the sense that now private insurance companies use its standards of care. They have codified them. So people's lives are affected by these documents that this professional association has created, right? State laws are increasingly recognizing WPATH, and now actually
Remember,
some of the federal
this person advised college students to do do-it-yourself
gender affirming care, like in Florida, actually are codifying the role of WPATH as well. And it's like, okay, well, is this what we really want to happen, right? It's a minimal, and I think actually largely losing game. I don't see this working out super well. And I actually think in some cases, it can make the situation worse. So in Florida, for instance, there was this injunction from a federal judge on this omnibus DeSantis anti-trans bill. And it was covered in the media in a really ridiculous way. It was very 2023. Every headline was like, judge eviscerates DeSantis administration, judge drops the mic on Florida. And it's like, when you go and read the injunction, okay, this judge granted 3 families, 3 families with trans teenagers permission to continue seeing their doctors and be prescribed medications. 3, not all trans kids in Florida. Okay, just 3 of them. And the judge let a lot of the rest of the law go into effect, including regulations that kicked off every single trans adult in Florida off their hormone prescriptions, right? And the way they did that was different.
Thanks,
right?
Tom.
The
After dark, I'll pull it up
on
for
gender
later.
affirming care for minors was just a blanket ban. And indeed, those seem to be fairly unconstitutional enough that federal courts are agreeing. But the way the law took trans adults' hormones away was different. They created all these new regulations that no one could follow. They said you can't be prescribed hormones from anyone but a physician. And actually 80% of people in Florida are prescribed their hormones by a nurse practitioner because we have a doctor shortage in this country, right? So boom, all of those people suddenly can't get their hormones from their primary care physician. The state also created a new consent form only for hormone replacement therapy and said doctors have to get patients.
Just let me boil it down to brass tacks, the argument this person is making. This person is saying it's way too hard to get trans affirming care. All of this is saying it's way too hard to do it. We need to make it easier to do it.
To fill out this form, but when the law went into effect, there was no form. So literally no doctor could comply with these rules, and thus everyone in Florida lost their prescriptions, at least temporarily. And what really disturbed me about that was, despite this judge's injunction going on in glowing terms about WPATH, what Florida did for adults, to me, sounds a lot like the original standards of care, creating these very high barriers to informed consent, creating all these weird supervision requirements and licensing requirements that don't exist for other forms of healthcare. And so I think that's probably partly why the judge didn't enjoin those parts of the law. They might not actually be unconstitutional. And then by codifying this WPATH model, I think actually, part of what the decision is doing is opening the door to Florida successfully banning, transition for adults. So it really worries me, just from a tactical perspective, that this is the direction that things have gone. But then on the flip side, to get to the other aspect of your question, I think there's just a much bigger scale we could be asking questions at
Not
in this moment, which is
explicitly,
like,
but
what would we prefer to be happening right now, right? Instead of playing defense always and always replying to, trying to debunk or correct or bring facts to bear on people who are, obviously acting in bad faith and really escalating their attacks. What's a bigger, broader, more affirmative, more exciting vision for trans freedom and bodily autonomy than medicalization? And I think that would also have an effect in terms of political mobilization. I just don't think many people want to get up in
Max, how do you feel about the law in Florida as a trans person? I'm just curious.
the morning and go cheer for the medical model that continues to mistreat them, if not neglect and abuse them, and that most people never had access to before. So, broadly, I think of this as a similar, and it's an interlocked issue with abortion, right? People aren't necessarily super excited to get out and defend the status quo of Roe versus Wade, where so many poor Black and brown people didn't have access to abortion anyways. Instead of a robust reproductive justice framework that completely, kind of shatters the idea that we need these narrow kind of legal rights to privacy, as opposed to making demands, right? Demands on the state, demands on the public, demands on one another of solidarity for the kind of world that we would like to live in which we're free to do things like get abortions or transition. So I think it's both
they
practical
conflate
to me,
abortion and
but
transition.
also about this much larger shift in this moment, and really trying to break a little bit the way that I think a lot of liberal institutions are actually quite happily wedded to their relationship to authoritarians, and actually are sort of working in symbiosis with them. I think we really have to be careful to break that relationship if we want to actually mount an effective counter politics. Yeah. That was a very long answer, but I see we have some questions coming in now. So
that was great, and it actually does move us into some of the questions from the community. So I'll just read them. The first question is, I 1000% share your frustration with aligning with the medical model, even as we can glimpse other liberatory models of gender identity. Are there any other movements / communities, etc., that we could ally with beyond uneasy medical partnerships? I often think we could do more to link trans rights with the abortion rights movement, for example, seeing the common cause of autonomy over our bodies, and continues to say,
linking trans rights and abortion rights. They do that all the time.
This possibility in gender as body autonomy, as betrayal, as collaborative future making.
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. Thanks. You were reading my mind as you were typing it in there. Right. I mean, I think coalition is really, to my mind, the biggest task at hand, right? Building much bigger constituencies here. And so that's also not just this sort of debate style of the transgender question, trans debate, trans rights. Should we or should we not? Right.
Because
part of the way that functions.
They link reproductive justice and trans rights because both are attacks on the gender binary. Abortion is an attack on the gender binary because abortion liberates women from the oppressive gender binary. Trans is an attack on the gender binary because their goal is to, as queer activists, is to abolish gender. That's why they're linked. They're both attacks on the gender binary.
So effectively is by exceptionalizing, singling out, and putting trans people to the side as somehow wildly different from all other groups of people who are experiencing the crises of contemporary capital and politics. When in reality, I think trans people just sort of often have a particularly Baroque, well-informed kind of Baroque understanding of the systems that are, in crisis in this moment, and actually can be of incredible, use inside larger movements. So connecting to abortion and reproductive justice, absolutely. I mean, it's the same legal principles, the same state legislatures, the same right-wing groups, the same Supreme Court. I mean, we're talking about the exact same dilemma here right? And the idea that the state can extremely override people's not just bodily, zone of integrity, but
You're welcome,
interfere in their
Panicky.
access to medical resources. It's the exact same playbook, right? And so it would be bizarre not to create more allyship there. And I think more broadly, connecting with disability justice activists.
This is a revelation I've had recently. Allyship is code for comrade. Allyship is the gateway drug to comrade.
And people who are actively organizing around the just incredible eugenic logic of the COVID-19 public health response and the incredible scale of death and suffering that has been, allowed to go on quite openly, right?
I'm just going
There
to
are
speed
just a
this
lot
up a
of
little bit to
places
keep us
where
on
the
time.
mode of connection and allyship is just that we're dealing with the same dynamics, right? And I think that to my mind is really the task at hand. So yeah, that I think as big a coalition as you can get, right, is probably what it's going to take to move the needle, rather than doing this sort of compartmentalized version of response where we only go to the correct experts who are in charge and who are the custodians of this area and promise our fealty to them and hope that they're able to bail us out, which is not really what they're there to do in the first place. Yeah.
Sorry if this is too fast. We're just on a schedule today.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a second question. Thank you so much for this rich talk. I'm wondering if the scope of your work allows for any comparative studies about how this conversation around contagion has developed globally, and even if not, have there been any instances from other regions that you've encountered which drew your attention or curiosity? Thank you.
Yeah, I love that question. Anti-trans political movements have transnational network connections, right? It is a little bit an Anglosphere thing, the version that we're living through, right? The US, the UK, Canada, Australia. There's this sort of particular brand of anti-trans movement that really has been quite intensely focused on the idea of social contagion. I really think it is a very much an Anglosphere kind of concept. But anti-trans politics seem to be most of use to authoritarian political movements. So you can see them obviously in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, in Russia. You can track them in all sorts of places. Really complex and interesting and alarming developments, in right-wing movements in India. You can track similar things in the Philippines, throughout Latin America, right? Often, many of which are funded by US organizations, particularly Christian organizations and churches. But yeah, I think the idea of social contagion, right, is a particularly Anglophone idea. But I also want to say, right, kind of thinking through the actual complexity of the sociability of something like trans as a category, we also have to think about the kind of colonial politics of contagion, that actually there is a globalizing export of a Euro-American, a deeply ethnocentric version of trans codified in things like standards of care that are being held up as the gold standard or best practices around the world and are reshaping laws, right, sort of following Yogyakarta principles of gender self-determination in many, many different countries around the world, but are also affecting the actual delivery of healthcare. And although the standards of care have this weird sort of section that's like, cultural competency is really important, it's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the whole point, right? So actually, part of the other side of contagion of trans, not really relevant to this conversation today per se, though, is like, that it's not really contagion, it's actually like colonial circulation, and the replacement of many thousands of other ways of life with a Western transgender version is a process that's been ongoing for centuries, but I think is accelerating in certain ways right now. So definitely an area where I really hope more folks are going to be doing even more research.
Folks, FOLX.
Yeah, really appreciate that question.
Awesome. The third question that we have is, thank you for your presentation. I'm sympathetic to your argument, but I'm skeptical of the political viability of the reframing you propose, given the ferocity of the current anti-trans moment. From both political observation and personal experience, I've noticed that for many people, conservative arguments like the left-handedness graphic or the assertion that transition results from an essentialized true self are the only way they can be made to understand transness. How do we go about reframing the debate responsibly without playing into right-wing narratives about contagion?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you for being so thoughtful in putting it together too. And I want to underline that reference to the ferocity of the anti-trans movement. I think that's really key, right? And I totally know what this question asker is talking about, right? Those deeply conservative arguments about being born this way or the left-handedness graph are so popular because most of the people who find those acceptable agree with right-wing ideas to a large extent, right? They don't actually like trans people. They don't actually want there to be lots of trans people in the world. They're relieved to hear, oh, there's only actually so many. And so, that number will never get too high. And they were born that way, so it's not their fault. And really implicitly, it's a deeply transphobic, form of inclusion, right? So the liberal project of inclusion, well, they couldn't help it,
These people don't believe that you have to be born that way to be trans. They don't believe in gender dysphoria.
I want to say about that, right, is like, this is difficult in terms of building political coalition, but it's like, I don't really think that kind of allyship is that useful, right? And one of the ways I don't think it's useful is I think doubling down on the medical model. It involves a lot of sacrifice, right? So we have gender affirming care in this version before it's being banned, but it's a version premised on the sacrifice of most people who want to transition who don't qualify, right? That's the legacy of this field.
What she's arguing is that you shouldn't need to have gender dysphoria in order to be trans. Anyone can decide to be trans at any time. because they want everyone to decide to be queer and to basically give up gender entirely. So of course you can't be born that way. It's not a medical condition, it's not a psychological condition, it's not any of that. You can decide to do this at any time.
Medicine is most people don't get to transition. And to me, that's sort of an intolerable kind of sacrifice to make in order to advance a smaller group of trans people's interests, right? It class stratifies and racializes trans people as a class. So it's mostly middle-class trans people and predominantly white trans people who get access to gender.
Let's educate our new friend about how they're going to get over the issue of propagating the species. Does anyone know? How are they going to propagate the species when they've created a world full of days? Hint, think Brave New World. Think Logan's Run. Think The Giver. We have them on tape talking about this. This is not theoretical. How are they going to propagate or populate the species? Surrogacy, 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 surrogacy.
Affirming care and all of the civil rights that come along.
Machine, we're getting into we're going down an abolish the family rabbit hole right now. But if you go into the video, go to my Substack, carlin.substack.com. There's a link in the top that says Video Vault, and there's a specific video about this one specifically.
Along with it, right? The ability to change gender markers, the ability to work, in formal employment and things like that. And so, I guess my sort of pitch here is that what's missing on the pro-trans side is ferocity. No one's really, going toe to toe. No one's matching the danger being targeted and directed at us. And I actually think failing to match that is itself a kind of lost opportunity in terms of political tactics. But I don't think we're losing too much by giving up this conservative, essentialized point of view, because I don't think it really ends up helping very many people, and it deliberately sacrifices entire groups of people, right? Like I said, I think we could end up in a place, not like I said, I'm thinking about the fact that I think we could end up in a place in a few years where transition, abortion used to be as technically legal, but most people can't really get it. Maybe kids can't transition at all, and maybe a lot of adults can't in certain states too. And that's really awful. That's really horrifying. But that was also de facto the reality prior to this political movement, that most trans people couldn't.
Machine, if you didn't know how to speak French and all of a sudden you were dropped into the middle of France, you wouldn't understand what anyone was saying. This is the same thing. You're not stupid. You're just a beginner. Nothing wrong with being a beginner. We'll get you up to speed quickly. Just stick around.
Who wanted to transition couldn't get access to it. So as disturbing and dangerous as things are, I think that's actually precisely the reason why now is a good moment to question, right, whether working so hard on reassuring people that their animosity towards trans people in general is okay, and that they can just tolerate the ones that doctors have told us are here for good, that will really be anything but a kind of Pyrrhic victory. So, but I just want to say I really empathize with the danger. And actually the question of how to do this without playing back into the hand of the right on contagion is a really good question. I'm still thinking a lot about that. I think it does, again, have to do with this refusal to match ferocity, right? Like, it's just politics. You have to outflank the other side, right? You're gonna have to out-organize them. You're gonna have to develop techniques of persuasion that are more compelling, right? And I wouldn't pretend to be able to develop all of those by myself, but I do think there is a sort of question here about how to reclaim sociability, right? I probably would say let's not call it contagion, but like sociability, right? And just say like, no, gender is sociable. So like, yeah, you should be a little unnerved by trans people. We're here to unnerve you because of the world that we live in, right? But like, I think that's a fight worth having because otherwise we have to give up too many of
trans people are here to unnerve you. I'm going to clip that later.
Excellent. I think we have enough time for a couple more, at least one. The fourth question is, this was amazing. Thank you so much. What strategies of trans contagion beyond existing as trans are you thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, broadly, the way I think about it is gender already is contagious. Like our psyches are contagious. We're all formed intersubjectively. So to me, it's more about a shift in acknowledgement and rhetoric rather than having to be much of a shift in practice, right? I actually just think it is the case that our genders are contagious, so that we're sort of locked into a project of denial and disavowal to reassure ourselves that that's not the case. And so I think we're just sort of ignoring everything that actually falls under what you were referring to as existing, as trans, right? And I think that to my mind is so not really sort of developing anything new here, but actually thinking about how we can come to claim just the basic empirical realities of how we live in the world, and sort of making some of those kinds of value statements that I don't merely just want to tolerate people if they turn out to be trans after a lot of investigation, but I actively greet and welcome trans people in the world. I'm not afraid of people transitioning. I want transition to be as easy to do as possible. Like those are probably some of the action points, but more broadly to me, it's kind of like a paradigm shift. Yeah. Or I don't know, an acknowledgement. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay, we have a question about WPATH. Can these types of gatekeeping bodies be transformed, or is the gatekeeping function inextricable from their institutional mission?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm writing more about the history of WPATH right now, so I'm a little early into this project, but I don't see how it could be taken out. I mean, I don't know, WPATH it was formed to gatekeep. I mean, that was its modus operandi, the explicit reason it came into existence. And so I'm not sure how it would ever abandon that, right? It has professional stakes in doing so. People's careers, salaries, grants, faculty positions, clinical businesses all depend on this system, right? And now it's so deeply intertwined with private insurance and public insurance reimbursement schemas. I think it's really hard to imagine WPATH letting go of that. The standards of care have been subject to critique nonstop since the first ones were published in 1979. And for years, the organization, if you go and read their internal records, they know that, and they're writing each other letters being like, okay, basically everyone hates us. Like all trans people hate us, and they think we don't care about them, and we're really cruel.
Gilead would come from the right if they had power. It's not just the left who wants Gilead.
Revise them, and now it's become such a bogged down political process. I'm just very skeptical of it, I know lots of people who are part of WPATH. I've been a part of consulting, processes myself, so it's not like a particular animus on my part. I'm just very skeptical as a historian, having looked at the moving parts and the historical legacy. I'm not sure how you take an organization that existed to gatekeep and make it non-gatekeeping, right? It just doesn't really have any other function. And I think the rebranding to WPATH in 2007 was really smart. All of a sudden, this organization that did the opposite of affirming gender, right, since 1977 is like, oh no, now we're the premier venue for affirming gender. Like that was a really smart move, but they didn't actually change the standards very much. You still need psychiatric supervision and diagnosis to access physical health care. That's, to me, absurd on its face. It's illogical. It serves no legitimate purpose. There's no diagnosis of being trans going on. It's just a gatekeeping interference tactic.
Oh, I
don't know what
WPATH
would do if they eliminated that role. I mean, like half their membership would no longer have part
basically Jules Gil-Peterson, who again, Jules Gil-Peterson advised college students at Lewis and Clark College to do it-yourself hormones. Jules Gil-Peterson just said, I don't know why we have to have psychiatric care. I don't know why that would be important for trans people. Why don't they just give us the drugs? Why don't everyone make it easy? Why is WPATH being a gatekeeper? And like, I'm not a fan of I'm saying this is me now. I'm not a fan of WPATH, but I think it's very interesting that Jules Gil-Peterson is like, WPATH is just a gatekeeping organization that, god damn it, those goddamn gatekeepers want you to have psychological care before you get on the hormones.
Job anymore. So yeah, I'm very skeptical about it. And just to say, there are rival alternative organizations, and so why does WPATH have to be the ship that sinks or swims, right? Sinks or floats? I don't know, bad metaphor, right? There could be an alternative mode for doing this.
We have 2 more minutes, so I'm going to slip one more question in, I think,
Sure.
and it's related to this. So the question is, I'm interested on your thoughts regarding standardizing care for trans folks. I worked at Mount Sinai and was very involved in opening the Center for Transgender Medicine and Surgery, which we relied on members of US WPATH to shape the center and sponsor doctors to learn how to provide gender-affirming care. I hear your concerns surrounding WPATH, so I'm wondering what you believe to be the most effective way to teach doctors gender-affirming care and shaping standards of care.
Yeah, it's such a great question because there are these real practical issues we have, right? In places that can still provide gender-affirming care. I mean, the wait lists and lack of qualified clinicians is just kind of off the charts, right? At the same time, I think there are bigger practical questions to be had, right? I mean, gender-affirming care as a specialty doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense to me, right? Like hormone therapy, not, primary care physicians and nurse practitioners can deliver that. And it seems in some ways that that would go a long way if we sort of refigure, right, hormones as part of primary care, that's, training given in medical school. That might be one way to solve that practical bottleneck issue. But when it comes to qualified surgeons, this is a really huge issue. There aren't enough surgeons who are qualified to meet the demand out in the world, right? And so I also think there's a bigger question about investing in the infrastructure that it takes to make transition accessible, right? And that involves medical school changes in medical schools. And these are all just, to me, sort of forms of harm reduction, right? It's like, hormones, medicalizing hormones to the extent that we've done it doesn't really make much sense to me, but obviously surgeries are as I would know, since I'm writing a book about this, not very easy to do yourself. So we need qualified surgeons who are available, right, at no cost to people. I think there's a real training bottleneck going on, but it's gonna require investment, right? It costs money. And so I think that's also a shift towards more public commitments to funding, but also to funding healthcare in general. I mean, we just have such a shortage of doctors, skilled specialists, primary care physicians. There is a crisis in US healthcare, and trans healthcare is really only maybe one of many sites that are deeply affected by it. So I really hear that question. And I think that a public collective solution of investment is going to be much more effective here than anything else. Yeah.
Thank you.
This hour went by really fast. I'm sorry.
All right, guys. I think we need to wrap up for today. Now, this is usually a little bit quicker than I normally do it, so I apologize. We had to speed it up a little bit at the end, but that is because coming up next, we have a very special supporter exclusive spy stream today. And we are going inside a live woke meeting talking about education related things. That's your only hint. And if you want to join us for this spy stream, which is going to start in about 3 minutes on another stream, what you need to do is you need to go over to my Substack, Carlyn, KARLYN.substack.com. You need to click the link that is like right in the center of the Substack right now. And what this is you will find under this box for supporters a link to join me on YouTube. And I'm going to be setting up the Rumble link next. I'm going to add it to the post. I could not set the Rumble link up until we finish this stream. So this is going to be a private stream. This is only for supporters. If you're a supporter on Locals or Patreon or a YouTube channel member, I already put the information there as well. So it should be there. Just check in the supporter area and come and join us for Spy Stream. It's going to be up next. This is where we go into a live training. We don't know what's going to happen. It's going to be great. But I got to wrap this up for right now, guys. Please go sign up for the Substack as a supporter for $8 a month, $80 a year. And you will get access to not only supporter-only Spy Stream, but also a whole bunch of other perks as well. That's all I have for right this second. I will see my supporters in just a couple minutes, guys. Thank you for joining me today. We'll be back at 5 p.m. tomorrow for happy hour. And I got a great one coming up tomorrow, too. All right, guys, take care, and I'll see my supporters soon.